Stop. What you're doing right now is horribly damaging your thyroid. And whether or not you know you have a thyroid issue, these everyday activities could be wreaking havoc on your health and well-being. But today we're going to be talking to Keith Littlewood, who's been working in the health and fitness industry for over 20 years. And after receiving a master's degree in endocrinology, he's giving back to people with his knowledge of everything hormone. So how do we get your thyroid back on track? Let's ask him. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any of the amazing guests that we have coming up on the show. And with that, let's just jump right into it. Tomo, thanks for spending time with me today here on Road to Recovery Podcast. As I said in the intro, you have a lot of information to share with us about hormonal health, but let's kind of start just with the bread and butter, really baseline stuff of why thyroid is important and sort of the functions that maybe people don't associate thyroid with, but that it's very key to.
Sure. Well, it's actually a critical hormone from cradle to grave, really. I mean, the importance of thyroid cannot be understated during the basis of birth, which is fertility and gestation. If there's not enough thyroid hormone circulating, then one of the most obvious features of low thyroid that was found to be commonplace in certain environments was cretinism, which is basically the poor neurological development of a fetus, particularly in the central nervous system. So if you're not seeing the development occurring, if you're not seeing growth occurring, this can be implicated from a lack of thyroid hormone. And that's becoming more and more prevalent because of the amount of endocrine disruptors and hormone disruptors in our environment. But it follows that growth curve. If a lot of people associate, say, growth hormone with why people don't get to appropriate stature, but it's actually thyroid hormone that's implicated in that. And then there are various other features throughout life, whether it's kind of liver function, central nervous system function in the brain, how you think, how you perceive, perhaps how you even ruminate on negative thoughts, as an example. And then coming down to your classic kind of metabolic effects, such as cholesterol, blood glucose, blood pressure levels, and also cardiac function, as well is very much implicated as a factor in thyroid hormone. So you can perhaps understand how important it is to keep the thyroid functioning, because not just from a cardiometabolic perspective, how we think and perceive about the world, perhaps, weight gain, weight loss, sleep, fertility, all of these things, coherent biology is ultimately dictated by thyroid hormone. And I'll quote one of my mentors, Ray Pete, who said that life doesn't really get beyond slow, clumsy, cold biology if you don't have adequate thyroid hormone. And that's why, thyroid in most living organisms is a key factor. And what we're seeing is, for example, in aquatic life forms, thyroid disruption occurring at quite a high rate, therefore altered growth states, in some cases infertility, certainly growth aspects, unwanted growth aspects, and proliferation of tissues is something that we tend to see as well in the aquatic environments. So it's not just dictated to kind of, terra firma and land, for an example, and mammals. It's affecting amphibians and other life forms as well.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many factors that can, as we'll get into later in the podcast, there's so many factors that affect thyroid health that I think mainstream people or people in the mainstream that aren't really in the know or in the wellness community won't even think about. We're going to talk about plastics, endocrine disruptors, stuff like that. I mean, all of these things that everyone is doing on a daily basis, and they just don't know. I mean, I in some ways, I continue to do these things knowingly, which is even worse. So I think that's kind of the hardest thing. But I mean, just as we're kind of just diving in, I mean, when people think of thyroid health, I mean, they go to their doctor, they get their basic TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone, which is from, I believe, the pituitary, right? Pituitary gland. So different gland, but that's what they'll generally check. Maybe you can tell us, because you have a little more insight, why they look at the TSH in isolation. Is it more of like a cost thing? I'm not really sure. But to really get a good view of your thyroid health, you need to be looking at more markers. And I'd like to know what those ones would be if anyone's curious.
Sure. Well, TSH, as you rightly suggested, is a pituitary hormone. And I tend to view the pituitary as more of a backup than anything else. We should have systemic kind of peripheral conversion of thyroid hormone taking place at the liver, kidneys, or most organs and all the tissues in the body. Now, when that doesn't occur, what tends to happen is because there's a low level of circulating hormones, usually of T4 and T3, it goes up via these negative feedback loops and other aspects of transmission. And you'll see the hypothalamus will then produce something called thyroid releasing hormone, which will then stimulate the pituitary to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which will then stimulate the thyroid gland itself through a number of mechanisms that will basically take iodide and tyrosine and turn that into thyroid hormone through a number of mechanisms. Ultimately, T4 and a little bit T3 will be released into the system. Now, the problem is that the TSH is, we could almost call it a stress hormone, because high levels of the TSH are associated with fibrosis. When we see stimulation of something called the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, we can tend to see some correlation with certain disease states, and certainly also immune responses as well. So what we should be striving for is optimal peripheral conversion. And bear in mind that sometimes the assessment isn't actually what's going on within the central nervous system. And certainly the comparison between the central nervous system and the peripheral tissues is problematic. So if a clinician's just looking at TSH, that doesn't mean anything, because there are a number of factors why TSH can appear completely normal. There are many other well-respected thyroid researchers that never used to treat TSH and got them into trouble with various medical associations, because they said ultimately the TSH took so long to catch up. And if someone was under chronic states of stress, we know that malnutrition, undereating suppresses TSH as an example. So that can appear completely normal. And also perhaps even the reference range, which has come under question multiple times as being totally inappropriate, needs revising. Now, if you're looking at TSH on its own, you're not looking at T4. Most clinicians do look at a combination of TSH and usually free T4, suggesting that the free is the more kind of appropriate one to look at. I still think total thyroid hormones are absolutely appropriate. I think we should be looking at free T3 and total T3 as well, and also markers like reverse T3, just as an example, to give us an idea if T4 is ultimately having an optimal conversion or deiodination to T3 rather than going to reverse T3. So they're just some very basic markers that you can look at. And going back, back to the 40s and 30s as an example, there were some very well-respected doctors that understood that temperature, pulse, metabolic rate, cholesterol values, Achilles tendon reflexes were very good indicators of thyroid function. And that's my own personal belief, is that people aren't encouraged to look at thyroid hormone appropriately, because it then opens the door for diminishing the prescription and effects of single source medications like statins, like antihypertensives, metformin, glucose medication, and that interrupts billions and billions of dollars of profits. And I think what we're seeing generally within the world at the moment is that profits are taking place over most people's health. And I think a lot of people get their head around that.
I mean, it's a really big discussion. I think it's become even bigger over the last year. And
very much so.
Hopefully, I mean, I'm hoping that it'll continue to be a discussion, because I feel like that's the only way you can, get the word out, is if you keep proliferating discussion. Unfortunately, it takes horrible events to, create discussion around that. And unfortunately, worsening of people's health. But I mean, one thing I wanted to talk about, kind of continuing that discussion about markers and sort of like symptomatic things, are what are some like indicators? I know for me, so I have an anorexia background. Anyone that watches this podcast will know that me and my partner, who isn't here with us for this episode, both have eating disorder backgrounds, and that can just send like a plethora of damage around the body. It affects every single organ system, your skeletal system, all these things. And thyroid is like definitely not left unchecked. And I feel like for me, I had undiagnosed thyroid issues for probably many years. Like you mentioned earlier, the reference range being debatable. And mine was always, I mean, it's a wide reference range. I know where I'm at. It's like from 0 point something to 5 or 5.5. And like some will argue that it shouldn't ever be above like 2.5 on the range or something like that, or 3. And so I know that that's kind of a debatable thing, but like, what are some indicators of laggy thyroid and like slow oxidation and stuff like that? Because I think that can get, I mean, so many things overlap. I know being cold is one of them, and I definitely experienced that one.
Yeah. Well, like I say, thyroid hormone permeates every single aspect of function, from sleep to fertility to cholesterol use to oxidation of glucose, and ultimately it's part of the thermogenic response. And we know that as the body gets colder, it becomes less efficient, can't do many things, from perceive what is stressful and what is not. And I think, if we're kind of looking at perhaps the nuance of eating disorders, and I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on eating disorders because I'm not, but I just want to put something out there, is perhaps that some people say that when, let's say, I'm going to use anorexia as an example. Some people say that hypothyroidism comes from anorexia. And that ties into what a lot of the older research has suggested, that actually what they tended to see, not overweight people, but underweight people. Now, in a classic current medical paradigm, the suggestion is that as you become more anorexic, you become more hypothyroidism. And therefore, the classic signs of something called non-thyroidal illness syndrome, where you see very low levels of T3 and high levels of reverse T3, because remember, T4 would be deiodinated or kind of made less, it's not able to convert to T3. You have higher levels of reverse T3. But if we perhaps roll it back to levels of organization and perception, and how you think about yourself, how you think about the world at large, what's going on, whether you can see through the level of BS that's kind of within marketing strategies, between societal pressures, and again, ultimately how you see yourself. Perhaps some level of hypothyroidism is always there. Now, that could come from in utero disruption, from environmental pollutants, from stress, from the mother's diet, which is often something that's classically ignored. And also there are inheritable traits from the mother that can be passed on to offspring. So if we think about that as an example, perhaps the lack of optimal organization and thyroid hormones already persisting in the brain could be a precursor to the way that you think about yourself and society around you. Not to belittle also the concept of experience, growing up. There are other precursors that would kind of predispose you to that. Right. But again, the ability to kind of see around you, and part of that's going to become from how you're raised, what your parents instill within you. So it's a multifactorial problem. But I think it's just important to note that perhaps hypothyroid people are more inclined to be more anxious, more depressed, have more negative mood states about them, that then lead them into this kind of quagmire of kind of disordered eating. So perhaps there's always, as I'm suggesting, there's a level of low thyroid function already there. There's a lack of optimal neurotransmitters. There's all these kind of increases in mood states suggest, and whether it's depression or anxiety, these are key factors of low thyroid function.
No, I would actually completely agree. Like I said, I'm not a quote expert other than an expert of experience with things like anorexia. But in my personal experience, and just talking to people that we've worked with, or talking to other people that have gone through similar states of malnutrition and anorexia, is that there's so many commonalities across the board with people that experience eating disorders, whether that be like childhood trauma, a lot of emotional things, like you mentioned, like the way you were raised by your family, stressful life events. But I do believe that there is some sort of molecular chemical underlying thing that all of us do share in common, whether that be thyroid or etc. Lack of, like you mentioned, neurotransmitters. I mean, that's something that I've discovered through various testing are those things. Mm-hmm. And I do find that there would probably be a pretty sweeping commonality with people with eating disorders and this sort of behavior. And that goes back to, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the environment that we live in today. And why is it that we have this persistent rise in disease, and specifically mental health illnesses, that is just almost unfathomable. My mother's a school teacher, teaches first grade, and in her 35 years of teaching has never seen this amount of young children being diagnosed with anxiety and various, mental health problems at such a young age in her classroom, and becoming a persistent problem. But I think we live in a society that is perpetuating it as normal. Like this is just like an underdiagnosed problem that is finally being diagnosed properly. And I just can't believe that that's a thing, if that is how sick humanity actually is normally supposed to be. Like it makes me question a lot of things in our in our just the way we live. But I'm curious too as to why do people with thyroid issues often see other hormonal imbalances? I know a lot of people with thyroid issues also have problems with like sex hormones, whether that's like testosterone or estradiol and estrogen. But I was curious, like, if it all comes back to the thyroid, or are these separate problems? Or, I mean, you like to talk about like root cause, and we'll talk
Yeah.
about pollutants and stuff like that. But I think that's where
Yeah.
we'll lead. But I was just curious what you've seen in your work and work with clients.
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is that just like every other part of the body, the testicles or the ovaries are all thyroid dependent. When we have low levels of thyroid hormone, low levels of conversion, the energy production at those sites, and bear in mind the steroid producing areas like the gonads, as an example, they are huge users of energy. You also produce large amounts of oxidative stress. So maintaining the energy production at its most optimal state, which is aerobic metabolism, sure, there are states where we fall back into glycolysis, but it should be a relatively temporary thing. So to the extent that you can produce hormones is usually an extent of how much energy you can produce as a starter. And going back to, as an example, what your mother's seeing, I think that's very relevant, because it's been, since the Second World War, where there's been a vast explosion of chemicals. And also to bearing in mind that the source of these chemicals can come from foodstuffs. We know that genetically modified foods are sprayed with vast amounts of chemicals. We know that combustion in the air. We know that perfluoroalkyls from Teflon and the waterproofing kind of structures, and the non-stick stuff. And whether it's triclosan, the hand wash that was used for many years. I think it's banned in the US, but certainly still in other areas of the world. Organotins, other endocrine disruptors that we get in cleaning products. It's vast. And to say that we've been absolutely capable of observing the effects of all these pollutants at certain levels, it's not happened, because a lot of the previous testing has been very problematic and hasn't identified what these low-level mixtures do. And I'm just kind of glossing the surface here. There are literally hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are doing that. So if you then bring it back and you're seeing, the concept of declining fertility isn't something new. I remember reading papers from back in 20, 30 years ago that saying human fertility is becoming a big issue. And when you get disruption of the steroid sex producing centers, this is where you'll see kind of, again, the pituitary being called on to fall back on, so that you can produce more hormones. So we know that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone help the gonads to produce the hormones that are not being produced because of these failing structures. It's a bit like in menopause, as an example, when you see high levels of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone going up, because the ovaries, as an example, aren't producing as much progesterone and perhaps little bits of estrogens, depending on how you view the loss of gonadal function in females. But it's the same thing in guys. You'll start to see all of these issues come back because the pituitary hormones are increasing. And if you bring that back to kind of, disordered eating, as an example, you'll see higher rates of growth hormone. Growth hormone in itself, when it, just like prolactin, they have knock-on effects to how the body functions. Excess amounts of growth hormone are associated with diabetes and cancer. Prolactin increases associated with high estrogens and estrogen responsive tumors that we can see not just in females, in males as well. So it's a very connected, complex scenario that I don't think has been assessed appropriately. And then we have large corporate organizations that tend to want to promote that incomplete form of analysis. And also, the fact that it is complicated, sometimes it's really hard to do proper scientific tests that justify the real problem.
Well, like you mentioned, I mean, it's really difficult because a lot of quote like trials or studies that are done are often looking at like one parameter, and with these things that are multifactorial, which anyone that has any sort of chronic condition or like autoimmune disease or anything, there's so many factors that are playing into this thing that it almost makes it completely impossible to tackle from a purely Western medicine perspective of viewing disease. And I think the same thing goes for thyroid. I mean, like I went to a functional neurologist who diagnosed my hypothyroid And I, even being a functional neurologist who is functionally trained, I was put on NP thyroid. Like that was the fix. And I
Right.
think like, while that may be like a Band-Aid, I don't think it's addressing like certain environmental factors that I've like clearly gone through and had to like kind of navigate myself, and also just toxin load. And I feel like a lot of people that also deal with these sort of systemic issues with thyroid or sex hormones and stuff like that might have some underlying problems with, being able to detoxify themselves. I know methylation is a thing. Hopefully you didn't freeze and we still have connection. There you are. But
Yeah, we're still good.
there are just so many confounding factors that, like you said, it becomes hard to troubleshoot, which is where someone like working with someone like you probably is beneficial, because you have a wider view of all of these problems, as opposed to just, delivering a Band-Aid to somebody and kind of calling it good.
Well,
But
I do think, I do. Sorry.
Oh no, continue.
Well, I do think restoring thyroid hormone is a very important thing to do. And like you said, some people do
For
just
sure.
steam ahead and kind of prescribe hormones. Nutrition is the foundation. And just say, again, we use disordered eating as an example. The refeed strategy is as important as everything else, right? And also bringing thyroid hormone in. For some people, wading in with a certain dose is going to be problematic. Making sure you've got the thyroid cofactors optimized, making sure you've got digestive dysfunction sorted, making sure you've got liver function sorted. But ultimately, that might come back down to, remember, the liver is a key peripheral converter of thyroid hormone,
Yes.
and very thyroid hormone responsive. So there is certainly a case for it. But again, getting the foundational factors is extremely important. And if you don't get that right, then that's why wading in with thyroid hormone should be considered after you've kind of worked on the base. Though, to be honest, some people can benefit from the start. And it's where you look at the nuances of individual function, to be honest.
Exactly. I mean, everyone's going to be slightly different. I don't have anything against, like, I don't blame my functional neurologist for just giving me thyroid and calling it there. Like, I probably needed it. Like, I saw the numbers. So there is benefit to like getting your numbers back to an optimal place while you work on the other things to build a base up. And then hopefully the idea is you can either reduce medication or get off of it at some point, depending on your case. It really depends.
Sure.
But I know many people that have been able to like reduce medication, for instance, for use of thyroid, which is really exciting for people like that. But I want to get into too, because speaking of now malnourishment, I mean, we live in a society where generally people are just overfed and undernourished, in just a very basic statement. But like, what vitamins and minerals are really vital to thyroid health? And I know like selenium and iodine. I had a discussion with a friend recently who also has hypothyroid, who believed that for most of his life, the main reason he was dealing with the hypothyroid was lack of iodine, like proper iodine to selenium levels. And that was a massive problem. So I was curious what you found to be kind of the major contributors as far as like nutrition goes to people's thyroid.
Sure. I think all the things you mentioned there: selenium, iodine, iodide. Zinc is a very key factor of thyroid hormone, primarily because it extends into the thyroid receptors, and you have the thyroid response elements as zinc structures. You could also argue that adequate protein is essential. You could certainly make a case with vitamin A and retinol, and how hormones are converted generally, whether it's steroidal hormones or thyroid hormones, as an example. Generally focusing on the kind of retinol rather than the beta carotenoids, because if you are low thyroid, it's very easy just to overwhelm the liver, and you can often see those kind of fat pads on the hand that turn slightly orange because there's a carotenoid excess. So I think that they tend to be the basics. Adequate carbohydrate. There's certainly instances and studies that showing that low carbohydrate diets contribute to less thyroid conversion. I think also keeping polyunsaturated fats to a minimum can be useful because of their hijacking effect on thyroid transport proteins. So I think, some studies have suggested that taking omega-3s as an example can actually slow, Graves' disease down, which would kind of support its thyroid limiting effects. So I think that the main things would be the kind of the thyroid cofactors. Magnesium is important as well. And even iron can be important for thyroid hormone as well. But it's very easy to go into a very high iron state, and it's often quite rare that many people are actually iron deficient. But it could be as widespread as anything. Even tyrosine is a key example. Remember that thyroid hormone is produced because iodide, and you have something called the sodium iodide transporter or symporter, brings iodide into the thyroid gland. It binds with tyrosine, and you have these two tyrosine molecules with 4 iodide molecules, which create T4. And then, depending on the deiodination, which is selenium dependent, and that's why selenium is very important, can create the ring to be reduced at the outer to produce T3, or again, if there's excess levels of T4, to then go to reverse T3. So I think all of those are particularly important. Certainly, eating to excess can have an effect on the thyroid, because large amounts of fatty acids, whether saturated or unsaturated, can support the role of thyroid hormones being kicked off the binding proteins. That's not so much important in the bloodstream in the body, but in the brain, where transthyretin is a primary carrier of thyroid hormones. This can be of particular importance. So I think that will be the basics. I always think getting adequate sunlight is very, very useful. I think getting adequate carbon dioxide sometimes, if you're living at sea level, can also be helpful for thyroid hormone. And they're things that I encourage with clients. There are certainly other kind of thyroid hormone supplements that they don't have a direct role, but they can sometimes increase the circulating values of thyroid hormone, perhaps by decreasing the amount of stress or reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress that goes on. So taurine would be one of those as an example. And there are other things like that. But generally, getting a good solid base, whether it's 3 meals a day or 5 to 6 meals a day, whatever works for you, is usually key to maintaining thyroid and liver function.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of friends that are sort of in the ketogenic animal-based area of nutrition, and I know a lot of times they'll run into people or clients that have a lagging T3 at some point, and a lot of it is, it's very basic, but for them they're just simply under eating, because they've cut so much out from their diet that protein and fat can be pretty filling, and protein in particular can be pretty filling. And when you do that, you can easily feel like you're eating more than you actually are, and you end up eating 1,300 calories a day, and you have no idea. And so I think definitely getting enough food is something that's important. I was curious about, because I believe it was you who shared on your story the other day something. I believe it was a study or an article about omega-3s, and too many omega-3s disrupting thyroid function, not being beneficial over like one was it like 1 gram? Was that what the paper was saying?
Yeah, that was for atrial fibrillation, which the study was suggesting that anything over that was implicated. And bear in mind that atrial fibrillation is a factor with thyroid hormone as well. So as you become more hypothyroid, particularly in the heart, you don't get enough energy, and that's why the kind of heart rate slows. Aspects of the heart become quite fibrotic. You don't get adequate. Imagine like your Achilles tendon. One of the key tests used to be as a diagnostic tool for low thyroid function was the Achilles tendon or Waltman's reflex test, where you'd tap on the tendon, and instead of it being like that, it would be kind of go and then almost like a slow closing pneumatic door, as an example. Now imagine that extending to the heart. Instead of contracting, releasing very efficiently, and good steady regular heartbeat, the heart slows right down, and you can get an idea perhaps why the heart might become kind of unable to sustain regular heart rates and become quite suffer from fibrillation and other cardiac manifestations. And this can also tie into kind of advanced fatty acid oxidation, which the heart is primarily designed to do, is to oxidize fatty acids. However, it should have the capacity to be quite flexible with carbohydrates, and the inability to use carbohydrates, particularly within the heart, is often the sign of the diabetic manifestations, aggressive fatty acid oxidation. You get many more lipid peroxides being produced, and you also have the issue that not enough carbon dioxide is being produced, because we know that carbohydrates produce more carbon dioxide than fatty acids. Therefore, it's slightly more self-promoting of optimal aerobic metabolism, and this kind of concept of the electron transport chain, which pumps these protons across to create energy. So, I think that food can be a key component of that. And I think it's where everybody's banging on about the benefits of kind of fish oils. There is a catch to them, because they do lower cholesterol, but that lowering is perhaps problematic. and we need to look at the wider inferences and perhaps the longitudinal data of what happens from chronic ingestions of those, what happens to the kind of other cardiac tissues, and going above this 1 gram, because it's really hard to avoid omega-3s.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you eat any amount of seafood, you get omega-3s in oysters, which I think are a great source of selenium and zinc and copper for the thyroid, as an example. Certain seafoods have that as well. So it's hard to avoid omega-3s. But I think if you are going above that 1 gram mark, then unless you're getting certainly much more vitamin E, you're predisposing structures to this kind of aggressive lipid peroxidation, and that's why even most kind of fish oils or certainly some of the supplements have added vitamin E to prevent that peroxidation, which prevents them going rancid, even their kind of shelf-like state, as an example.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting talking about the different kind of lipid profiles, especially like with oils and stuff like that. Because what I've noticed is, like you mentioned with the vitamin E, because vitamin E will help prevent that oxidation from the omega-6s. That's why like it's beneficial in cases like that when you're consuming anything that's an omega-3 or PUFA or something like that, because vitamin E can kind of buffer some of the damage that's being oxidized. But I've done, for instance, a kind of a lipid oxidation test to see like what percentage of your lipids are being oxidized. And it was pretty high. And I was kind of associating that with my level of omega-3 / omega-6 oils, particularly just slamming olive oil all the time, which is, I mean, it's not a seed oil like people say, the classic seed oils like canola oil, but it is a higher like omega-6 to omega-3 than say like something else, or it's not like a saturated fat coming from butter or ghee or tallow or something like that. And so I was actually curious if you've seen, because I know olive oil is like really touted as being like this very beneficial food. I think it can be. I think there's like a lot of problems with a lot of olive oils out there just due to sourcing and being cut with certain things. It's hard to source a good olive oil. But would there be benefits to, say, if you even had a good olive oil, but you're like oxidizing? Because I've seen this in a number of people in eliminating those types of oils. Because an interesting comment was made by a friend of mine where he was looking at the nutrition profile of canola oil to olive oil. And canola oil actually has a better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than olive oil, yet canola oil is demonized because of how it's processed, etc. And so he was bringing into question why people tout olive oil when canola oil is this way, and in some ways better from just a pure numbers point of view.
Sure.
I know that was a lot there.
No, I'm going to unravel that. I think, if you look at the supposed benefits of a Mediterranean diet, some people say it's the olive oil, some people say it's the amount of fish they eat, some people it's the amount of sunshine they have, probably a little bit of everything, and probably some of the less stressful environments. But I think olive oil does add in a particularly restorative effect. I don't think it has a problematic oxidation profile. Omega-3s can disrupt many aspects, including the proposed cell membrane where the lipids, particularly the phospholipids, exist. And I think olive oil, it's interesting that very advanced lipid peroxidation states have occurred with DHA and EPA as an example, but olive oil being brought in has helped to kind of be less aggressive and rescue some of the damage that was going on within the oxidative metabolism. So I think olive oil is particularly useful. And again, coming into your points about sourcing, I think a really easy way to do it is just get your olive oil and stick it in the fridge. And if it turns cloudy and kind of is quite sticky and into kind of more of like a paste, then you're probably onto a good thing there. I think all the stories before where supposedly the mafia was getting olive oil and just filling it with like kind of canola oils and other rapeseed oils and selling it as virgin olive oil. So everyone was kind of chowing down on it, and maybe that wasn't as beneficial. But I think if you kind of talk about the omega-3 to omega-6 profile, I'm still not convinced that that's a valid mechanism, to be honest.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, and although there are many different thought processes that support that, primarily because when there's more omega-3s, you have less cholesterol. But then if you're looking at the examples, what causes heart disease? Is it the high cholesterol?
Yeah.
Or is it the coronary artery calcification that tends to occur? And I think this level of calcification can be more problematic. So, we know that cholesterol tends to go to the area where it's been damaged, as an example. So it's no surprise that you see this atheroma and this kind of coagulation of kind of different, proteins and cholesterol and minerals like calcium, as an example. So it's kind of understanding that actually, cholesterol probably is a problem when it's going to an area and causing a blockage in that way. And perhaps taking omega-3s can help to lower cholesterol, but you're not kind of vindicating the damage that's going on in the endothelium, or kind of, the kind of the surrounding tissue that kind of envelopes and creates the blood vessel. So if you're getting kind of structural damage, you may be predisposing to other absolute events rather than focusing on the relative risk that you see from lowering the cholesterol. You're still going to see perhaps gross calcification in certain areas. And this is where other parts of diet comes into play regarding adequate calcium intake, as an example.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, there's so many nuances to this that it's just like endless discussion, really. But it's really fascinating. We had on the podcast not too long ago, Dr. Stephen Hussey, who's written some pretty good stuff on heart health. He had a really good book on heart health. And we talked about the cholesterol thing a lot. And I mean, that's been a debate at this point. I feel like some of it's been beaten to death in a good way, because it's getting the correct message out there that I think cholesterol isn't just the only issue to look at. It's the calcification. And I had another friend of mine who Liv Vitae, who's on Instagram and does nutrition stuff as well, bring up an interesting point that maybe we need to look at certain things as like the body actually trying to help itself, but causing more problems by helping itself. And that's not this problem. I mean, we could get into other things like amyloid plaquing in the brain. Like, is amyloid the problem, or is amyloid trying to be the solution, but it's just causing more problems?
I have a theory on that as well. So
we'll do a part 2 then, because I think that'll be very fun. I think there's a lot of stuff we could get into. But I just kind of wanted to go back, because I know we've mentioned certain environmental factors that can, cause, endocrine disruption, thyroid dysfunction. We talked about chemicals, like cleaning chemicals. There's just hundreds of thousands of these things that are just impossible to keep track of. But what are some of the big things that you have clients work on to either minimize or try to get rid of in their lives environmentally, whether that be like plastic use, etc.? What are some of the big things that you try to get people to focus on to hopefully turn some things around?
Well, first of all, I'm minimal on testing for a lot of clients, because most of these things are ubiquitous. There's plastics in the air, there's combustion engines in the air. I think just taking charge of some of the things that we know, and I have lots of resources that I send to clients. It might be on, for example, it might be on managing kind of some of the kind of classic heavy pollutants in the house, like cleaning products. Understanding what ionic surfactants and all the cleaning products do, whether it's through from dishwasher products to washing liquids, and cleaning products that they use. So sometimes they're not going to be able to manage their kind of environment when they step outside the door, but understand that their home is their cocoon, that they restore themselves. So that's kind of managing air quality in the home, bearing in mind that household dust has been shown to be a significant cause of endocrine disruptors and contains multiple pollutants. The most of these being things like brominated flame retardants, phthalates, PCBs, and more to boot. So, it's understanding what you can do. Certainly focusing on foods that, I'm a big believer in eating, organic based foods where possible. Not to say that organic foods don't have a level of pesticides on, but some of the more aggressive pesticides we see on more commercial, perhaps GMO based foods should be cause for concern. I think managing Wi-Fi exposure, electromagnetic stress can be particularly important. I think even if somebody does live in very polluted urban environments, as I said, managing by having the house as a relatively kind of good place to restore. You might have air filters in your home, you might have water filters. Understanding things like fluoride and chlorine can be problematic to health, and also using weekends to get away to environments that have very kind of you'll notice how good you feel when you go to an area that's not polluted, or perhaps not swamped in kind of Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi thing is a bit tenuous because, there are studies, and I do believe that we are going to see that the problems associated with electromagnetic stress, which has been known for decades, that electromagnetic fields do impact health. They can either enhance healing or totally disrupt it. And that's been known, and there's some really good books going back to the 40s and 50s on electromagnetic fields. So it's not tenuous in my book, but people want to see kind of more robust studies on, like Wi-Fi exposure, telecoms, towers. And I think the ones that we see already, where we're seeing oxidative stress to kind of reproductive tissues, and thyroid as an example, that even just can be heated up by electronic devices. Imagine having a phone all the time. So these are the kind of things that I get clients to get a grasp on, understanding that their food is a primary driver of their foundation of success. And then we start to look at the more nuanced issues of hormone balance once we've got on top of the basics. But, if you can, for an example, come home and you've had a cleaner, or someone's been cleaning in the house, and you can smell all these chemicals. Well, as an old mentor of mine said, if you can smell it, it's already in your bloodstream. Mm-hmm. So if you're kind of constantly having to deal with, inhaled particles, which we know there are absolutely millions of particles traveling around at any one time. If you're eating or consuming them or drinking them or putting them on your skin, as an example, these are, all things that need to be considered. So it's about getting those foundational principles right. Understanding that plastics are present in a lot of things, understanding that our water and food and air supply are a big part of that, I think is the key. And, important to get those things right before, and mold is a big one as well. So I have to bring that up. Mold poisoning, I think, is ubiquitous. I mean, I live in a city, I live in the Middle East, so we run off AC units, and I know when our AC units have not been looked after, because we all come down with sniffles and issues, and mold poisoning on top of low thyroid function, and mold poisoning causing low thyroid function on top of everything else is something that shouldn't be understated.
It's very fascinating, the mold in particular. As I sit here drinking out of my plastic Starbucks cup here, I won't pretend to not be a hypocrite. But it is interesting about the mold thing. That's something that the nutritionist I'm working with has been getting me to try and look into more, because I've lived in several homes over the last couple of years before I got extra sick, past anorexia, extra sick, where I had flooding in all of these homes, including the basement where I sit right now, had flooding and, mold potential. And like you said, I do think mold, hell, coffee, there's mold potential for this as well. Mm-hmm. So, and I think it's just, like you said, some people are predisposed, say they have poor methylation, they have poor detoxification. I myself have a double, it's a double allele for MTHFR. I have a compound heterozygous, so one mutation in both, which just makes me a more poor methylator than a lot of people. So I have to try and be more cognizant of some of these things. And that's even nuanced as well, because I know people like to dive down the gene train and pretend that genes are everything, but it's also your environment that triggers these genes to turn on and off. Very nuanced. But there are just so many multiple factors. But I think that was a good list. Like you mentioned, it's doing the basics. I think bringing it back to basics for people is what's going to help them make the most change. Because if you start giving them, it's impossible to avoid all environmental stressors, especially in today's age. And with the way that we have to live, a lot of people have 9-to-5 jobs. They work in an office. They can't necessarily be outside in the sun all day long and get that stuff. There are certain constraints that people have monetarily with testing, which is why I actually appreciate that you do minimal testing and focus on more of the environmental stuff, because I think it translates a lot more to people. There's more commonality than I think people see.
Absolutely.
But I would just, as we kind of go towards the end of our podcast here, I just would love to just hear any pro tips that you have for people just starting out or trying to troubleshoot just things in their environment or their food. I know going more organic where you can is a big thing for sure. And that's a good first thing to do. But what are some other things? Speaking of the electromagnetic stuff, I turn off my Wi-Fi at night. I don't sleep with my Wi-Fi on. I try to keep my phone on airplane mode when I'm not using it as much as possible. I limit blue light in the evening, especially stuff like that. I have blue blockers. I try to wear wired headphones. try to keep away from like, this thing is also very nuanced and like kind of woo woo sometimes, but what are some other things you think people can do to kind of just move in the right direction with themselves?
Well, I'll quote the biologist Dennis Noble, who said genes equals 0%, environment equals 0%, but when you add environment and genes together, it equals 100%. So, to the extent that genes are really just at the behest of the environment and the choices that most people make, we tend to express very negative genes when we don't get our choices right, or we're just so kind of suppressed by the environmental pollutants that are kind of there. But there is many things that you can do. And I think all of those things are relevant. I've never gone down the route of blue light blocking glasses. If I ever have my phone or computer on, it's usually kind of on the kind of blue light blocking mode on that, but I think I've always found it really interesting when I say to people, do you ever turn your Wi-Fi off in the house at home? And they look at me like it's something that requires an essay to actually kind of compute. And it's like,
Literally everyone
you literally
brought
just
it up
turn
to.
the plug socket off and then back on again, and nothing else happens. But you're also reducing some form of electromagnetic stress. I've also come across people, I said, where's your Wi-Fi router? Oh, it's under the bed. I'm like, okay, right, that's something easily we can change. But people are just, it's a bit like air pollution. If you can't see it, you don't worry about it. And that's very much true with EMF. If you can't see it, you generally don't understand the negative consequences of it, but you will experience ill health on some level when you're constantly bombarded to it. In this other study here, I remember my wife kind of working. We used to have the Wi-Fi router in here, and she was working a lot. I said, why don't you just plug the Ethernet in and not have the Wi-Fi on? And instead of coming out fried after a day's work, it's like, oh yeah, it's very, very different. And it's just kind of, again, going back to those foundational principles. So eating good food, understanding the environmental stresses at work, understanding what you can change, and make really positive kind of steps to kind of improving your biology, which ultimately improve your perception. And a lot of people are dogmatic, particularly with nutritional belief systems, or even when it comes to kind of more societal things. And sometimes your perception and your kind of rigidity about something is based upon how optimal your energy is. I always think that the sign of good thyroid function is how open you are to kind of other people's arguments. It's like Karl Popper's critical rationalism, where you want to understand why somebody kind of perceives that in a way that's totally different to yours, and you can get a really good idea of why the difference in opinion is. And I think to the extent that you're not open to listen to anyone or listening to new ideas when you're actually suffering with ill health is a good sign that it's not working for you. You're not flexible enough to entertain ideas, and you're persisting in this little circle of managing symptoms, whereas the symptoms are just kind of, they're the expression that things are not working. And people like to suppress symptoms without changing their biology. So I think understanding about why you have the symptoms and why, some people say, I don't eat breakfast in the morning because my digestive system is really messed up. And it's like, well, there's a reason why your digestive system is really messed up. And that's the stress, or that's the foodstuffs that you're choosing to eat. That's the fillers or the preservatives in the foodstuffs that you're eating. And understanding why dairy is actually a really useful, helpful, protective food. And so, understanding calcium to phosphate ratios or phosphorus, understanding, the benefits of getting adequate carbohydrates in. There are so many things to consider. But ultimately, if your energy, digestion, sleep, libido, mood, pain levels are not functioning, there are some key things from a nutritional and hormone standpoint that you can do to change them.
Exactly. I mean, I think the idea that I just want to keep getting across to people is that there are things you can do. I meet people, unfortunately, I meet younger and younger people all the time that are dealing with multiple complex problems, whether from mental health to physical chronic pain or both. And it's really, I mean, being one of those people, I understand, but it's very disheartening to meet even younger people than me dealing with it in their teens, or like even younger, like their tweens, like dealing with problems. And they just are brought up in this society where they're made to feel like this is the way it has to be, and that this is the way it's going to be. And I'm only going to ever be able to feel this X amount of good. And I'm just going to have to deal with this amount of pain forever. And they don't ever seem to think that their lack of sleep, their really poor diet, their undernutrition, their any of these things have to have any factor in that. They just don't think it plays any role because they're not told. I mean, most GPs are not trained in nutrition, so
No,
they're not trained to teach you that. So it's just disheartening. So that's why I like doing things like this, because I just want to give people up that there are things that you can do and that you should seek them out, and that you shouldn't feel alone and lost in like this is the way it has to be. So I appreciate what you do and the work you're doing and putting out there publicly for people, because I think it's very valuable. And I look forward to hopefully talking again more. I'd love to get into the weeds about some of the EMF, and then also just some of the just pathways that all of these things take that with thyroid function. This is really just a sort of a base level podcast for people to get introduced to the topic if they haven't already. But please tell people where they can find you. I know you have your Instagram, your website, all these amazing places with free resources, awesome resources. So let them know.
Yeah, I don't have much because I can't bear being on multiple things.
I'm with you.
I'm on Instagram, which is Tomo Littlewood. My website is balancedbodymind.com, of which there's a Facebook page as well. I think I'm on MeWe somewhere, but nobody seems to be using that. But hopefully one day I can get away from Facebook. But yeah, that's generally the main thins. And my email is keith@balancedbodymind.com if anybody chooses to reach out.